like the video, subscribe for more horror, and drop your country in the comments. Now get ready. This story comes from a place most people fear to remember. I came to the cabin because of an inheritance, and because people who vanish leave a kind of vacuum that the living want to fill, and perhaps because I fancied myself brave enough to confront something that had scared my town into silence for generations. The road up the ridge was a thread of cracked asphalt that dwindled into packed dirt, and by late afternoon the map on my phone gave up and I drove the last mile with nothing but trees pressing close to my windows and the sky turning the color of old coins. And when I finally saw my uncle's cabin, half sunk into moss and roots, its porch sagging like a tired jaw, I felt a hollow in my chest that had nothing to do with the climb. He had been a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, a collector of odd facts, a solitary gardener of strange ideas, and when the lawyer's letter said his estate had been left to me, I thought only of paperwork and keys. I did not expect the smell that struck me as I opened the door, a metallic tang under the dust, a trace like iron and wet soil that made my mouth taste 1 degree colder. Inside, the logs were lined with books and jars, loose pages pinned with thumbtacks, maps with paths scored into them, and notes in a handwriting that grew more desperate the older the pages. My uncle's last entries smearing into jagged scrawl. Do not go after sunset, do not speak the names, do not answer when called. I laughed aloud then, a small brittle sound, because men who live alone write warnings as if they are facts you can file into drawers. Still, the warning felt like a string pulled taut in the room, waiting to be plucked. That night I slept in his narrow bed and woke twice to the house settling, once to the creak of the floorboards, once to the faint sound of my name on the wind, a syllable carried like a feather through the pines. I thought of the town's gossip that my uncle had finally given himself over to the forest, that he had quietly walked into the trees and been taken by something old and patient. But the radiator clanked and the kettle on the stove sang, and I put the thought away as superstition until the third time I heard my name, and it was not wind but a voice, soft and familiar, spoken in the exact cadence my uncle used to call me on childhood mornings, and when I stepped to the window and looked out, the trees sat like an ocean, dark and static, and a shadow moved between the trunks as if an enormous hand dragged something invisible along the ground. I considered that I might be overreacting, that grief sharpens every noise into accusation, and yet my uncle's journal lay open on the table with a new line written that night in fresh ink. If you heard us before you leave, the forest has chosen you. And in the morning when I went to leave, my truck would not turn over, and the battery that had been full an hour earlier read dead, as if the machine refused to obey the will that would carry me away. And when I tried to walk the lane down to the main road, the path shifted underfoot, roots entwining like fingers, and the trees leaning inward as though to make a tunnel that swallowed the light. At the edge of the yard, something, had placed a ring of small pale stones, and inside that ring a scrap of paper. A single name written in hand I did not know, and beneath it the word return, and the hair on my arms rose because it looked like an offering or a list. People in the valley told me the forest had always been strange. Winds that came without clouds, deer that stared with empty eyes, a hush at midday where only stones should make noise. But the real oddness was a pattern of patience, the way the trees seemed to wait for a sound they liked and then learn it until it had no owner left. My uncle's notebooks described listening not as a metaphor but as a possession. The forest listens, learns, imitates, and then calls back what it finds most beloved. And the last pages were a kind of arithmetic of loss, names written down and offered like currency, rituals to trick the listening into taking only husks rather than beating hearts, knots tied on wrists as a charm, bowls of rainwater left on thresholds so the forest could steep on its own terms. I told myself I would stay only one night and that I would leave before dusk the next day, but the forest has a way of erasing the geometry of a timetable. People who spend too much time near it begin to feel the hours stretch and fold, as if the day has been rewound and replayed until choices become exhausted. On the first night I did not hear the distant calls as much as feel them like a pressure against the back of my skull, and in the mist that rolled through the yard there were shapes that were not quite animals and not quite people, tall, thin, and wholly wrong, moving as if cords of shadow dragged them. They did not speak, they did not run. They watched with the terrible courtesy of a thing that knows the value of patience, and in the morning I found that every door on the porch had a pebble placed in front of it, smooth white stones arranged in the exact number of family members on the village census. as if the forest kept an inventory and was beginning to reconcile it with the real world. On the second day, I set out along a narrow animal track my uncle had circled on a map and labeled "Do Not Follow" at dusk, telling myself that no legend would bend my steps. That fossil fear belongs to people who have no appetite for questions. But the woods ahead had a quality of hush that swallowed only some sounds and kept others: the passing of my foot, the wet slap of leaves, the soft sigh of my breathing, while the world beyond melted into an absence. As I walked deeper, the path lost the regularity of a man-made trail and became a memory trail. Places where footprints had been pressed by people long vanished, and the soil remembered the shape of their steps so strongly that it tugged at your ankles with every footfall. At the forest's heart, the light condensed into slashes and shafts, and on either side the trunks bore marks like tally marks crossed with symbols I could not decipher, and somewhere beyond I heard a bell tone, low and old, as if made by some metal that had listened to centuries. And when I came to a small clearing, there were the remains of an old campfire, neat piles of ash set like a pile of from last year offerings, and beside them a boy-sized shoe, caked in mud and abandoned as if the owner had simply grown out of it overnight. My stomach tightened when a voice, distant and layered, echoed the exact cadence of my mother's laughter, a sound I had not expected to hear again outside the grave. And the forest folded that laughter into a call, and then a second voice. My brother's, or someone who had once been my brother in the way people are brothers for a season, whispered my name with a tenderness that made me want to run toward the sound and then recoil. My uncle had written that the forest does not take by force alone. It tempers its approach with love, with imitation, with the uncanny generosity of a thing that offers you a ghost of what you have lost, so you will step forward to grasp it. Deeper still, the marks on the trees became fresher. The bark shredded into patterns that suggested hands, and at the base of a huge oak there was a shallow bowl of black water rimmed with ash, and inside the water items floated a brass button, a child's tooth, a scrap of cloth with embroidery in a mother's hand. Objects that were not mine, and yet when I bent close to look I felt a pull, a tiny tug at the skin of my face like a memory being unstitched. I realized with a cold clarity that the place operated like a brain, and that its synapses were entire lives, and that each time it practiced a voice it stored that voice until it could call it back with confidence. The local practice borrowed from ages of caution. Do not repeat a voice you hear. Do not say a name when called. Tie a knot on your wrist and keep your favorite sound in your pocket so the hollow, as my uncle called it, would not steal the sound from the place it lived. That night the wind died and the hollow sang in multiple voices, and my uncle's voice in particular rose above the others, urgent then pleading, instructive then begging. Do not follow the path of what you love. It will fold you inside like paper. I slept with a pebble in my mouth, as an old woman in the village had shown me, and dreamt of roots wrapping like ropes around the town's bell tower, muffling the peal until the only sound left in the valley was the slow scrape of something turning under the earth. In the morning a child in the village, he who had been left as an offering years ago and later returned with eyes too bright, came to the cabin on bare feet and placed a scrap of newspaper on my table with a single sentence circled: "Remember to keep your name to yourself," and he smiled without joy as if he had been given part of a story to recite at a later time. People in the valley lived with trades, small economies of voice that seemed cruel when explained out loud, but to them these trades had the texture of survival. In a hard winter you might give a lullaby to the hollow and receive back a field that grows. Or you might keep your voice and watch food fail while your neighbors eat. When I pressed them for details they would look away and say quietly that bargains are not always bargains once the other side learns your ledger, and they told me of a night when a mother traded her name for a child's cough to hush in the middle of winter and later realized the child's speech had been replaced by a tune she did not recognize. The forest kept both and, clever as a banker, lent back only what benefited its appetite. I began to notice small changes in myself. My tongue would stumble over a vowel I had always pronounced clearly. I would remember a joke and find it missing its punchline, and once, in the evening, the radio in my truck cracked as if under strain, and for a frantic second the host's voice was my uncle's mouth calling my childhood nickname before the station returned to its normal song. I stopped speaking the names of those I loved aloud and found I joked less, breathed less, and slept with the shutters closed as if a narrow beam of light could keep a beast of patient rooms at bay. Sometime during the third night the hollow decided to show me how it taught itself to be human. I had been careful with my voice up to that point, keeping my lips clamped as a mason might hold a brick, but curiosity is solvent. It eats through restraint until the thing inside you is soft enough to be molded, and curiosity drew me to the well in the clearing after dusk, where my uncle had carved marks around the stone and insisted in his notes that the rim be never disturbed after the bell chimes. There was always a bell somewhere in these valley customs, a small call to prayer or a rusted chime hung where travelers would pass, and as I approached the well the bell rang of its own accord, a single low tone that seemed to bother the night into holding its breath. Leaning over the rim I could see nothing but black that absorbed light like an animal swallowing a candle, and then from that darkness something breathed my name, and not my name alone, but my name lined up with other names, a pattern it was practicing like a student reciting texts. Imran, Malik, Yusuf, and the lights behind the trees answered with naps of echoed names not mine. A chorus that arranged itself into a list of voices the hollow had been collecting over years, decades, lifetimes. The air hummed as if a swarm of insects had tuned a radio, and then the practice became performance. Out of the black the hollow sent something upward, not a voice but a gesture, a memory. My mother's laugh folded into a howl, my uncle's cough thinned into a small song, and the well bubbled like a throat unsealing. My heart hammered and I clapped my hand over my mouth, fighting a surge like hunger in my chest that wanted to answer back, to call the name that rose like a ribbon. If you answer, my uncle had written in the margins, it learns you and keeps you like a knotted thread. But the hollow is patient and it grows cleverer, and when the voice it calls sounds like something you once loved, the temptation is harder to resist than any hunger. I ran from the well that night with a taste of iron in my mouth, and for days afterward I found traces of the place in my speech, the wrong inflection, a lull in a sentence where nothing had gone before. The valley people told me stories as if by telling them they might bruise the fairy tale out of the woods, but their tales were warnings with a mathematics to them. Once the hollow learns a voice it can call it back, and it will do so in stages, starting with quiet imitations that feel like memory, then moving to demands, then to offers dressed as mercy. They will offer you a swap, the old woman who runs the shop told me one afternoon while counting coins with hands that had known too many winters. A bit of what you miss for a scrap you never thought precious. Keep what is yours. Do not make the bargain. She looked at me as if weighing whether I was stubborn or foolish and added, houses are kept by promises. Forests are kept by names. Do not give either away. I watched the child priest do the quiet work of the village. He walked the perimeter at dusk, murmuring numbers rather than names, placing stones in patterns meant to confuse the curiosity of something that learns patterns, and I saw how, when the hollow learned a rhythm, it would send back a hollow person shaped like that rhythm to stand at the rim of the lane and test whether the residents could tell the difference between human and imitation. Sometimes the test failed and a family would wake to find one of their own standing in the doorway like a puppet with a face that shifted by the hour. The human shape looked right, but something inside the eyes was absent, and those replaced wore an odd patience, their conversations flat as plates. Late that week, exhausted and more frightened than I admitted even to myself, I attempted to leave under the rain, thinking perhaps water would wash the memory from the road, but the car refused to start and a figure stood at the corner of the clearing. Tall, wrapped in a coat that had once been brown but now looked like wet bark, and it turned its head toward me with that blank face and unfolded a hand that held a picture. My own house, in a frame, and in the background someone I loved was visible, smiling. For a brief, interior second, my legs gave at the idea the forest could show me someone like a mirage and then twisted into a trap, and I almost reached to that picture, almost moved to take it because the idea of proving the vision false felt like a possible victory. But the old woman's words rang in my skull and I stepped back and the figure lowered its hand and vanished into the trees like smoke. You can keep faith with superstition until you're faced with a physical choice, but the hollow often waits until that precise second to show you the cruelty of its curriculum. It will teach you how safe the world can feel and then ask you to hand it the very thing that proves you are human. Your voice, your memory, your name, in exchange for a moment of comfort, and then it takes and never gives back the whole. I want to tell you now about the night I finally understood the depth of the debt that the hollow extracts, because no elder's tale could prepare me for the arithmetic of loneliness that it performs. The final evening began with the sky bruised as if someone had pressed a thumb over the sun, and then, in a short storm, The rain came down like a curtain, and the valley smelled of wet loam and the kind of freshness that carries nothing living. And in that hour my uncle's last pages seemed to thrash in my head like a trapped bird. Do not answer when called, do not look into eyes that do not blink, do not trade a name for warmth. And yet the forest arranges need into a gentle, forging hand that feels sensible at the time. A neighbor whose baby grew ill the week before came to the cabin in the dark and asked me if there was anything I might give, for the hollow had demanded a promise and their yield had failed, and their voice when they spoke had the texture of defeat you only hear in those who have been bargaining for years. And in that moment I felt the old moral problem of small loves weighing heavy. Give up a recording of a voice to keep a child sleep, or keep your own voice and watch someone you love suffer. I imagined my uncle facing that arithmetic over and over until his notes grew ragged and fatalistic, and I thought maybe that is what broke him. So I agreed to help the neighbor and drove with them to the edge of the lane where a small ritual was prepared. A bowl of rainwater, a wrapped scrap of cloth that smelled faintly of cinnamon, and a lullaby half remembered, and the child priest, that pale boy with two bright eyes, stood exactly at the rim and sang a refrain without words while the neighbor held the cloth and begged aloud for mercy. I did not sing, I did not speak names, I only held the recording device my uncle had kept the year before and pressed record, and from the black throat of the well the hollow exhaled the first of its borrowed voices, a sound so like the neighbor's late father that the neighbor wept and offered the cloth with hands that trembled, and the hollow accepted, and the well swallowed the scrap, and the rain paused as if listening. And for a moment the child's breathing slowed, and the neighbor smiled, and I wanted to feel satisfaction. But the moment passed, and not 2 hours later the neighbor woke in terror to find their father standing at the foot of the bed, eyes like holes in a face, and the child's cough returned, with a new edge, as if it had learned to keep its misery quiet while something else took the shape of care. I fled that night, not because I was more righteous than the neighbor, but because I realized I had become part of the exchange, a clerk in a bank of voices, and the hollow's ledger now included my name. Running from a forest that can rearrange miles into a circle is a lesson in small defeats. The path you take seems ordinary until you look down and find the ground has already been wearing the imprint of your boots in the pattern the hollow likes, and when at last I reached the main road and the lights of the town I had come from glowed like beacons, I allowed myself to believe perhaps geography could sever the holding. Yet in the weeks that followed I began to hear, here and there, a sound that made my skin prickle, the echo of a laugh I had once known, a misremembered word slipping into my mouth, a neighbor saying my name in the grocery store and pausing with a curious hollow look as if tasting where the sound should have sat. And when friends asked me if I had been well, I found that for an instant my voice peeled away and another tone responded in its place, polite and flat. And one evening my mother called and asked if I would come home for a holiday, and I answered her with a phrase that was not mine at all, but something the hollow had been practicing for weeks on the edge of the well, and the way her voice shifted in response was like a hand reaching toward a missing light. Finally, I understood the worst piece of the hollow's economy. It does not merely take, it teaches what it takes to others, and in teaching it magnifies its appetite, until the world is full of people who can be called and whose echoes can be lifted from the air as if they were fruit. My uncle's last pages said the only thing that sometimes works is to take what the hollow has given and bury it where no sound can be, to staple your mouth and your mind and keep a private ledger of silence, but even this is only a postponement, for silence is a fragile thing and the hollow is patient as ocean. Tonight, years after I fled the ridge and found a life below the pines where people do their best to keep ordinary hours, I still dream that the trees press against my bedroom window and listen, and that in the corner a shadow stands that is not my own. And sometimes in sleep I wake with a voice on my tongue that is not mine at all. And in those nights I count my breaths and clutch a small pebble in my hand and promise myself never to answer. If you ever find yourself near the dead woods of a valley and you hear a call that sounds like a love you have lost, do not go. And if a neighbor asks for a promise in exchange for the easing of a cough, remember this story, and weigh the lives you can spare against the sound you owe. The dead man's forest does not simply kill. It catalogs, it curates, it teaches the world how to be empty by making sound into currency. And one day, if you are not careful, you will feel a small absence in the mouth where the shape of your laughter used to be, and a voice elsewhere will ring with your name. And when that happens you will understand why those who live near the hollow whisper its name only after sundown and keep their doors bolted. Why they tie thread around wrists and put pebbles in pockets. Why they teach children to count rather than to pray aloud. Because the forest remembers and it calls, and when it calls it will always be patient enough to wait for you to answer.